Thanks so much, David, and a big thank you to the Economic Research Council for organising this series. I think it's great to have A-level economics students hopefully getting some interaction with real-life economists and getting a sense of what it's like to work as an economist. And hopefully that will help to foster your love for economics. As I was saying earlier to those, to someone who asked a question to me, I didn't study economics at high school. It actually wasn't an option at my high school. But even so, I think whether you study it at secondary school or at university or even later in life, I think it really gives you a good lens on the world. So what I wanted to do today is to give you a particular view of what a bit of a sense of what my work at the CBI is like. I will explain what the CBI is like. I certainly didn't know what the CBI was when I was at secondary school. I'm not sure I even knew it at university. So give you a bit of a background on that. But mainly I wanted to talk to you about climate change and think about the role of economics in helping, and particularly economic policy and the role of the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance in the UK, working with business and the rest of the economy in helping to make the transition to a low carbon or net zero economy. So I will try and explain a bit some of those concepts. I think particularly with A-level and more broadly, in fact, any economics presentation, the real key is trying to get a sense of your audience, the level of knowledge. So do just ask me questions as we go along. I know it's not always that easy online, but do pop them in the chat if you have any questions, and David will help. And I'll also make sure we've got time at the end to have more of a discussion. But I also want to say a big thank you to all of you. I appreciate it's Thursday at 4 o'clock for many of you who are watching this live. I'm sure you've had quite an intense week at school anyway. But hopefully this will be interesting to you and spark your interest, I think, in what it means to be an economist and importantly, how we use economics to really tackle the very difficult challenges we face in our countries and our economy. So before I start, just a bit of background of this about the CBI. It stands for the Confederation of British Industry. We were founded in the 60s, but essentially we are a business organization, so we're a membership organization, and we represent businesses of all shapes and sizes, from the very big high street brands, to Boots, to many of the companies that you will see on your high streets, to very small businesses. We represent the full spectrum of different types of businesses. So from, both businesses who will be, traditional, the BPs and Shells of the world, to those businesses who have grown up, in the renewable energy space. So we do have the full spectrum across different sectors and across different regions of the UK. And I think that variety certainly makes the work as an economist interesting. But it also gives, our power as an organization, because we try to, come up with consensus across that wider business community on some of the big policy issues that are facing our economy. And I have a team of roughly around, I would say, 30 economists and different statisticians working with me with a wider range of policy specialists. So overall, we have about 100 economic and policy specialists. We are mainly UK based, but we do have very small international offices. And as well as doing economic forecasts and economic surveys, so surveying individual businesses and using that information, we also, do research and bring that all together to make the cases for different economic policies that businesses in particular would like to see. And hopefully as I go through, you'll get a sense of the flavor of what that work is like. And I guess our sort of purpose is really about thinking about how we build prosperity in the UK and the role of business in driving our overall economy. And our vision for the economy is, making sure we have a very innovative economy, that we're coming up with new ideas. And obviously the work in the invention of the AstraZeneca vaccine, one of the COVID vaccines, was developed in the UK. So how do we make sure that those sort of breakthrough technologies are continuing to be made in the UK? How do we make sure that we have an inclusive economy, that all the regions of the UK, people have a high standard of living? And how do we think about health in our economy? And I think that's something that really has shifted over the last few years during the pandemic, is just how important health is to the health of our economy. But I thought, before I sort of dive into my main topic, which I want to talk about climate change and the role of economic policy and business in making that transition, I thought I'd explain a little bit about why I study economics, why I studied it. So I think for me, I started with an interest in policy and politics. But the more I became aware of that, the more I realized that economics was really the language of policy and politics. And I wanted to learn this language. It felt a bit like a secret code. But I think also I was really interested in some of those very big questions out there. Why do some countries develop faster than others? Why do some countries have more inequality than others? How do we tackle inequality? How do we make sure that we fund our public services? These sort of big questions were really interesting to me. And after I studied, I did politics, philosophy, and economics at university. I then did my master's in economics. I then went to work for the Bank of England. And I think for me, the appeal of that was just, I thought I would be with a big group of economists and really get a good grounding in economics. And that definitely was true. I really enjoyed my time at the Bank of England. And I think what you can learn there, and also at ministries of finance and in the civil service, you really get exposed to some of these big questions around economics. And to also give you a sense, what are some of the questions that I and my team have been working on over the last few years at the CBI, to just give you a sense of the breadth of the things that we work on. So obviously I've been at the CBI about 8.5 years. So I was doing a lot of work in the run-up to the EU referendum, but also afterwards. So all those questions that we have seen both before the referendum, but also afterwards. What impact does being a member of the single market? So that's obviously one part of our trading relationship with the EU before Brexit. But as we've now left the single market, what does that mean for our economy? Those were some of the questions that I've worked on. Also, why is regional inequality in the UK? And this is, you should always test assumptions. There's different ways of measuring regional inequality, but generally it's accepted that in UK does have one of the highest regional inequalities. But interestingly, in the UK, we actually have quite a high inequality within regions. So even within London, there's a lot of inequality. And actually some of the wider regions in the north and west in the UK, for instance, you've got more, almost more diversity of inequality within the region as you do between regions in the UK. But what can policy do about it? It's the government's whole sort of levelling up agenda. I think one of the questions that maybe you might be interested in and will feel relevant is, during the pandemic, we worked closely with the government on the design of many of the schemes, like the furlough scheme, which was a scheme to help businesses and people make sure that they stayed in a job during the pandemic when many businesses were closed, and also of the lending schemes, which helped to keep many businesses of all sizes supported through the pandemic. But actually, one of the big questions that we sort of worked on was making the case for why schools should reopen as soon as possible. Because if I think back to that very immediate aftermath of the pandemic, understandably, everyone was very much focused on health and how we keep everyone safe. And that was important. But one of the things, and I think where economists played quite an important role, is as people learned more about how the infection spread, but also thinking not just about how the benefits to health potentially of keeping schools closed at that very initial period, but also that schools are really important for people's education, and also thinking about the benefits of how staying in education is important for individuals, but also the benefit. I mean, I'm sure some of us may have, that you may have been joyful at the beginning when schools were shut, but I'm sure many of you who had to learn online quickly found that missing your friends, not having that interaction with people actually had a toll on people's mental health as well as educational loss. And what economists have also shown over time is that, when you have moments where you're not able to stay in education, that can stay with you for a period of time. So, making the case for why schools should stay open, why it was also important for families as well and working parents, and just thinking about some of that wider cost benefit analysis. I think having economists in the room was helpful, as well as people who were only, health practitioners, really made it a more rounded decision. And I think that's why we saw schools start to reopen. And one of the interesting things around the economy is looking at how different countries had a different approach to that and what some of the effects are. But I think those are just some of the questions that we've been working on. And obviously, there's never been a dull moment in my time. There's the whole issues around the cost of living crisis. How do you help households? Who should you help? Should we be helping businesses with their energy costs? What about schools? Schools also have been facing very high energy costs. What's the right support there? And I think you've also seen with the devastating war in the Ukraine, how a geopolitical event and a devastating war in one country can then ripple through the whole world, not just through the humanitarian impact, but also thinking about the impact on the economy, the impact on oil and energy prices, and then what that has meant for ordinary people in the UK as well. But I want to really deep dive into how we tackle climate change and some of the role of economics and economic policy in addressing climate change. So I'm going to start very global, and then I will drill down into what that means for the UK. So I'm sure many of you have heard about the Paris Agreement and about COP26, which was hosted in the UK last year, and COP27, which was hosted in Egypt this year. And that conference of the parties is where different countries come together and try to address climate change through making pledges and targets about their nationally determined contributions. So that's almost looking at how much each individual country is contributing to carbon emissions, and each individual country is making commitments to reduce those overall emissions over time. And people talk about keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And I think one of the things to remember that's important that sometimes we forget is we've already seen quite a lot of global warming. So we are already at 1.2 degrees. And this chart and data is from something called the Climate Action Tracker. And basically so we're already at 1.2 degrees. So even to get to 1.5 degrees, it's only 0.3 more degrees of warming. So the Paris Agreement was trying to get as many countries behind emissions profiles that would keep warming down to that level. And it's generally seen that a net zero target by 2050 is what is needed across all countries to meet the Paris Agreement. But the challenge and what we're facing is that the overall policies and actions we've seen across the world, probably we're on track for a 2.7 degree warming if we don't take further action. And basically this is sort of, if we take some of the pledges and targets that were set out at COP26, so that was the one that the UK hosted, we saw a lot of work on the overall target. So now 90% of the world have a net zero target, but the challenge is we're not seeing the policy actions to deliver that target. And obviously it's easy to have a target that's in 2050. The real question is, what are we doing today to make sure that we're meeting interim targets in 2030? And in some sense, these will be the challenges that if you decide to pursue a career in economics, but wherever you are in our wider economy, these will become really important for over your professional life, because the amount of transformation we need to see in our economy is really quite phenomenal. And so this is just showing the overall emissions and saying, look, they've been rising globally over the past 20 years, and really over the next 10 years, we really need to significantly reduce some of those emissions, and that's going to take a lot of policy action. It needs action by households, actions by businesses, and action by government, and all of those working together to make this happen. So here I've used some charts, and the one thing I will say about economists is, and I definitely follow the, you need to like data, charts, different ways of putting that information across. So here, this is using charts and data from a report by the UK Committee on Climate Change, whose job is to monitor the overall UK emissions and importantly set out the overall envelope for, so it's essentially the scientific advisors who advise the government on what are the overall carbon budgets or profiles that are coherent or mean that we will meet that net zero target by 2050. But if we start with the chart on the left-hand side, I wanted to show that actually the UK has been one of the most successful G7 countries so far in reducing our overall carbon emissions. Because I think when you're talking about climate change, it's very easy to feel pessimistic and to feel that those emissions are going to keep rising. We don't know how to address this, and the problem is too hard. But actually, I think we need to remember where we have been successful. So actually, since 1990, you can see that that orange line, GDP per capita, so that's the amount, the whole amount that we are producing across our economy, divided by the number of people, has been increasing and has increased overall by about 40% over the last 30 years. So essentially, our standard of living as an economy has been increasing. And at the same time, we have also reduced not just our territorial emissions, so that is all the emissions that we produce here in the UK, but also the emissions that are inherent in our consumption. So you can see our territorial emissions have fallen by almost 50% since 1990. So we really have managed to decarbonize some of our economy already. We still have a lot to go, but I think it's important to remember that success. Now, some people say, well, actually, surely all we've done is ensure that some of the things we used to produce in the UK are now produced in other countries. For example, in China, where China may now have higher territorial emissions, so they may be producing many of the goods and services. So we import goods from China, and the emissions are now just in China. But actually, here the UK CCC are also measuring the emissions inherent within our consumption. So looking at all the things that we consume in the UK, and that's the purple line. And you can see that that has also fallen, not quite as far as our territorial emissions, but we have also reduced the emissions inherent in our overall consumption. So I think that is important. But I'm not going to underplay how challenging the next decade will be, because if we look at the chart on the right, what this is showing is our emissions from different sectors, essentially, of our economy. And you can see that one of the biggest, so the dotted line is the overall, the sort of baseline, so where we are now. And you can see that our emissions from surface transport are about 120 metric tons of carbon emissions. So the very, that's one of our highest emitting sectors. Those are all the cars on the roads, our trains, etc., how we get around. And in order to meet net zero, we need to reduce those to what's called the government pathway. So that's essentially the scenario that means we're on track to meet our net zero target here in the UK. We need to reduce those significantly. And what the UK CCC is saying is actually a good half of that, we have credible plans to deliver that. And why do we have credible plans on surface transport? It's because a big shift in our carbon emissions will come from the shift to electric vehicles. And actually, that shift will probably happen quite almost organically, not entirely. There's been policies that have helped to get it to the right space. But basically, if you look at the economics right now over the lifetime of an electric vehicle, the running costs are lower. Yes, some electric vehicles are more expensive than combustion engines, but actually over the lifetime of that vehicle, they have lower running costs. And now that we are starting to have more of the infrastructure to charge electric vehicles, people are naturally gravitating towards electric vehicles. And in some sense, that also reflects the fact that we do have rules and regulations as well to phase out combustion engines in the UK. So we do have some of the policies we need to make that shift in terms of road transportation. But there's still a lot that we need to do, thinking about shipping, thinking about trains, thinking about heavy goods vehicles, so lorries and trucks. We don't have all the policies in place. But there's a big piece around transport. Another big area will be around electricity supply. So we need to reduce. So yes, we've been very successful at moving some of our electricity generation onto renewables, but there's still further to go. But actually, some of the areas that will be most difficult to reduce our carbon emissions are thinking about heat in homes and in offices and schools and all our buildings. And that's an area where actually we haven't had enough policy yet to really help that transformation and move away from gas boilers onto heat pumps and onto other technologies. So I won't go through all of those in detail, but what you can see is these are some of the big sectors where we need to reduce our carbon emissions, and there's a whole role for policy in delivering some of that. So one of the things I think, again, this is just to sort of illustrate, when I showed that we've managed to reduce a lot of our carbon emissions here in the UK, most of that has come through looking at our electricity generation and the move away from coal. So you can see this is from a report which the Treasury did called the Net Zero Review. And what you can see is that we've managed to move away from having coal as being 30% of our electricity generation back in the late 90s to almost nothing now. And that it's coal which really does generate a lot of fossil fuel emissions, and that has been a big success on our part. And what has filled that gap? It's been renewable generation. So offshore wind, solar power, all of this has been really successful in the UK, though we do have more to do. And one of the things as well, I think is important to remember is as we've done that, we've also seen other co-benefits. So it's sometimes when we think about climate change, we think only about the importance of removing the emissions and what it does to global warming. But we forget that actually there are some important co-benefits. So if you think back, one illustration of this is in the 1950s in London, many people died when they had the pea soup fog because there was so much coal burning, and that was so damaging to people's health that when the wind wasn't blowing enough, many people got very sick and died. And you see the same thing at the moment with at a smaller level in terms of asthma. You know, if we can manage to reduce our carbon emissions, that does also reduce the amount of air pollution, and that means we will all live longer, healthier lives. And that's some of the work that actually my team have done, working with an organization called the Clean Air Fund to show some of the benefits for our wider economy from having and breathing cleaner air. So that gives you a bit of background of some of the success we've had, but now there's a huge role for the Treasury, our Ministry of Finance, and this is just showing a bit of what their overall job is. But I think why they play such an important role in climate change is actually, if you think about the pressure on our public services and more broadly, I think if you think back to the summer, it was really brought home to us how much climate change is here on our borders already in the UK. Previously, I think we've thought about climate change as hitting, and it will definitely have a bigger impact on obviously small island states that are close, have a low, close to sea level, and countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan, which are more vulnerable to flooding and some of the extreme climate events. But I think we saw in the summer, even extreme heat in the UK can be hugely damaging to our economy as well. So some of those changes are already present, and we need to start thinking about how we make sure our transport systems are resilient to hotter weather, even if that's as simple as air conditioning on the tube. But then if you're doing air conditioning, you need to make sure that that isn't dependent on fossil fuels for that cooling. But the OBR, which is the Office for Budget Responsibility, and in some sense provides a scorecard to our Ministry of Finance and look at the financial risk to the UK economy. While there are definitely costs in terms of making the transition to net zero, we need to invest to transform our economy. But I think it's important as economists to think about what happens if you don't do it. And I think one of the things the OBR have very clearly demonstrated is if we don't act, actually the overall cost of that inaction is 5 times as high. So yes, the cost may lead to an increase in our government debt of around 20% in our to GDP ratio over the next 30 years. But if we don't act, we could see our overall amount of debt increase by 100%. And that's before you take into account some of the co-benefits. So I think we all have an interest in trying to address climate change. And so this chart is again from that Treasury Net Zero review, and just trying to show some of the level of investment we'll need to see over the next decade. Now, some of that will need to come from public investment, but actually the vast majority of that will need to come from businesses. So we need to get businesses to help invest in some of these newer technologies. And in some cases, like in heat in our homes, actually the existing technology is out there. We know we can use air source heat pumps. We know that there are ways in which we can make our buildings more energy efficient. But in some cases, the technology isn't quite there yet. So sustainable aviation fuels, or if we're thinking about, there's a lot of talk about the hydrogen economy. So sometimes we need to put the right policies in place to help develop the innovation that will help to lead to some of this investment. So I think this was just a slide trying to step back and say, what is the role of policy in achieving that energy transition? What have we seen so far, and what will we need to see over the future? And I won't go into all of the detail on this, but I think if you think back 20 years ago, that's when we first saw the Stern review. So that was led by an economist, Nick Stern, who essentially showed this idea that the sooner we act on climate change, the lower the overall cost of that transition, and that the cost of inaction far outweighed the cost of acting. And that helped to develop carbon budgets, so the role of carbon pricing. I'll maybe come on to cover that in some questions. We established the UK Committee on Climate Change, and that helped to lead to the development of setting in place contracts for difference, which is essentially a way of sharing risk between the government and the private sector to help to develop some of the new technologies. So if you think back to offshore wind, when that was first developed, it wasn't as proven a technology as it is now, and the price of it was quite high. But the government used something called contract for difference to help to share some of the risk and some of the and have a co-financing model, which helped to develop that technology. And we'll need to see a lot of that across different sectors of the economy to really drive this transformation. And of course, so that I've talked a bit about the role of government policy in helping to make the transition to net zero, but there's a huge role for businesses and for each of us as consumers and households in making that transition. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is a real increase in the overall numbers of businesses who individually have net zero targets. So what does that mean? That means a business like Sainsbury's, for example, will look at not just their buildings, not just how their employees get to work, so that's part of the carbon emissions that's inherent in Sainsbury's, but they will also look at all the products, so all the things we buy in a supermarket. When we buy a pint of milk, or probably more controversially, some beef in a supermarket, there are carbon emissions inherent in the production of that good. Those are the Scope 3 emissions, and they are also part of that business's carbon emissions. So many businesses themselves have committed to reducing their own carbon emissions over a period of time. But actually, to be able to do that, it's not just actions by businesses. They will need to see some of those policies in place, and how we reform agriculture is a really important part of that as well. But we also have a role as households, and this is another chart from the Treasury's net zero review. It's a important source of information, though I would say I feel like they really need to jazz up the charts and come up with some better series of colors, because they're quite hard to read. But let me take you through that. This is essentially showing carbon emissions by dividing the UK households into different deciles. So looking on the right-hand side, you have richer households, and on the lower left-hand side, you have the bottom 10% of households. And what you can see here is that, first of all, richer households have higher carbon emissions. That's because they have bigger homes. That's because they buy more things. So their overall carbon emissions are higher. I think the second thing I really want you to think about is, where do those different emissions come from wherever you are in that income distribution? And what you can see is that you have some from food, which is thinking about what we eat. Important to think about that as we come at the end of Veganuary. But also heat. So heat is a big part in our homes. How we heat our homes is a big part of where emissions are. So when your parents tell you, put on a jumper, there's a reason for it. And if you care about the climate, you should put on an extra jumper. Might be a cause of some tension in my household. But also road transport. So how you get to school, how you travel around. Do you take a bus? Do you cycle? Or are you driving a petrol car? So these are, and also air transportation. So people talk a lot about flights, and yes, they are a big, globally an important or a big contributor to climate change. But obviously, individually, the majority of our transportation isn't actually through flying, it's generally through road transportation. But this just gives you a sense of where those different elements of our own carbon emissions come from. And of course, there's things we can do to change. But what I would say to you studying economics is it's actually using the power of economics to shape some of that thinking. So I won't go into this, but this is just some of the reports. I wanted to just finish by giving you a sense of some of the resources that are out there as economists. I'm sure your teachers will be directing you to them. But I think one of the advantages of being an economist now is there is so much open source data, so many websites that have charts and data that you can analyze and use yourself. And a few shout outs to the Core Economics Project, which is a way of providing open source materials and trying to change the way economics is taught, particularly at university, but there's certainly materials that A-level students can use as well. The Royal Economic Society as well tries to make economics more accessible to non-academics as well, and they have a series of kind of media briefings, and they're quite helpful. And you, of course, can go to government websites as well. And you're already connected with the Economic Research Council, but what I would say is there are a wealth of resources out there for you to choose from. So do use some of those. They're certainly helpful. And I'm going to stop there and open up to any questions via the chat, or David, or however you want to ask those questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan, for such an interesting talk. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all of those resources as well that you've linked there. I'll add them to the list that we'll send around to the teachers afterwards, so that everyone can receive those. But thank you very much. I appreciate it. So yeah, so if anyone did have any questions, feel free to just direct those to your teacher, who can then type them into the Q&A section. While we're waiting for those to filter in, I guess I did have one that kind of stemmed from, I think it was on slide 7 that you showed GDP per capita kind of going in one direction, and emissions from consumption and territorial emissions going in another direction. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on whether we can kind of truly decouple economic growth from emissions, or the extent to which we've done that already. And your slide showed some of that, especially kind of with regards to the whole degrowth movement and things such as that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, and it probably divides economists and analysts and business professionals. And I would say, and I guess in all, I think when I probably started my career, I fell into the more of the, you know, that we can continue increasing our overall growth and decouple our emissions at the same time. And I think we can do that, but I do think we make the job harder. But I think the important thing about the question is to almost step back and think about what we mean. And I guess because we have to think about the world economy, and one of the things is that, and I will probably get these stats wrong because I am just repeating them from what I heard from memory, but I think roughly, if everyone consumed, so if you think about consumption per head in the US versus Europe, versus a developing country, there's a huge difference in overall consumption per head and the carbon implicit within that consumption. And I think one of the tensions, and you saw this really play out at the most recent COP, is that, you know, some developing countries, individuals, if you're asking individuals to reduce their carbon emissions, if you are, you know, say a citizen in a rural community in Kenya, that's really different to if you are an American, you know, driving a large car and living in a large home. So my view is that I do think we have to have a more honest conversation in advanced economies about whether living standards are actually, on average, sufficiently high enough. That doesn't mean that you don't need to consider inequality within advanced economies, but I do feel at a certain stage, we are getting close to planetary boundaries. And actually, my concern about that is probably less about climate, but more about nature and biodiversity loss. And I think that's where the challenge at the moment is that we don't have not just, we don't have enough sort of price on carbon within what we produce, but we're also not properly taking into account the impact on water use, on biodiversity loss of many of the things that we consume. And so I guess I throw it back almost to a challenge to the young budding economists, is not only do I think we need to have a different approach to our traditional economic models and think not just, you will be taught in your courses around, and these are very important principles around land use, labor, capital, and technology, and how we bring those together to produce output. But what we don't consider in those models is the waste that we produce in that process, and also the impact not just on land use, but on biodiversity loss. So I think we need better basic economic models. But I do think we need to have more of the philosophical conversations about what levels of standard of living should we all be striving for, and at what stage do we say, actually, maybe it's enough. And maybe it's not that I say economies need to shrink, they can keep growing, but maybe we have sort of static growth, and that's what we should be aiming for. And that is, you know, that might be enough in advanced economies.
Great. Yeah, interesting stuff to think about. I guess none of us really have the answer to that right now. Kind of off the back of that, I guess we've got a question here. In the short run, do you think the transition to net zero will be beneficial or detrimental to overall living standards?
Yeah, so I guess it depends how you measure it. And I guess also from an economist, I think the most important thing is like, what happens if we don't tackle it? Because I think I saw some really interesting work by Oxford Economics, who do macroeconomic scenarios, who were looking at different scenarios with different degrees of warming and what it does to overall world GDP. And you can almost extrapolate from that into what it means for different countries. And I think that what is clear is if we didn't do anything about tackling climate change and let warming get to 3 or 4 degrees, we get to serious tipping points. And it was quite a scary presentation they gave. I think if we get to 5 degrees, we're into annihilation, which is a strong word. So I guess the challenge is if we don't do anything, there will be serious consequences for everyone. And I think one of the other things is in that transition as well is generally wealthier households and wealthier countries will be more insulated from the impacts, right? It is true that unfortunately during economic shocks, it generally is more vulnerable and poorer households who suffer some of the consequences first. So I think if we do it well, we can definitely do the transition to net zero and see rising living standards in the UK, and certainly rising quality of life, right? Better air quality, healthier lifestyles. And one of the things that the Treasury's net zero review is tries to think about the cost of the transition and how they should be distributed, because you need to start thinking about that and how you design policies, because, for example, moving to electric vehicles, you need to make sure that, poor households are able to do that transition. Electric vehicles may have a higher upfront cost. If then not only becomes a technology available to wealthier households, then you're providing a cost to low-income households, and that's probably not what you want to do. So I think you do need to think about how you design policies to make that transition well, and importantly, different taxation rates, etc. So, my view is if we do it well and we design the right policies, then in the short run, it can improve our overall living standards, particularly if we think about that from wider measures of living standards, including health and well-being.
Okay, great, thank you. Question here from Daniel. Do you think that fracking is a potential solution in terms of the net zero transition, even if it's only a temporary one, or do you think that it's got no role in it at all? I should say I'm not an engineer, so you may need to go and ask an engineer this question. But from my understanding from businesses that I speak to more generally, I don't think fracking is the solution in the UK. That's not to say that fracking may have a role in the US and in other countries, but I think there's a few issues. There are much better solutions, I think, in terms of our energy transition. So and ones that are cheaper as well, right? So I think there's more we can do around renewable energy. We'd be much better off focusing on policies on onshore wind, for example, than going to fracking. Fracking is expensive. It also has an impact on the water table and uncertain impact on some of the environment in the local area. And I think generally, even from within the energy sector, it's just not economic, the amount of investment that would need to do it in the UK. So I think the reasons why you might pursue it, and I think why the previous government were thinking about it, was more around energy security. So say you could do it very quickly, it might be part of the solution to thinking about how we address some of the challenges around high gas prices. But I think the challenge is it's a long term, you can't turn fracking on overnight. And I think generally it's not seen as, I think the UK CCC have also said it shouldn't play a role in our energy mix over the next 5 to 10 years. Well, thank you. I've got 2 questions here that I'll probably take at the same time because they're somewhat linked. Do you think the plan to broaden the exemptions on companies collaborating on initiatives that limit global warming will be beneficial, or will it cause market failure if firms form monopolies or collude? And in addition to that, how can we effectively incentivize firms as they're naturally profit maximizers? Do you think this is best done via regulation, subsidies, or perhaps educating consumers?
So I think on the last question, we need all three. So I think one of the things I would say is I think regulation plays a really important role, and actually interesting, and maybe people might find that surprising as somebody who, works for a business organization who you would think maybe our modus operandi is to always say, like, can we have as low regulation as possible? What's interesting is when you talk to businesses, many of them say, we want regulation, we want good regulation. And one example of that is in the built environment. So, I've had construction firms who say, look, construction is a regulated industry, right? For very good reasons. We have strong regulations about how you can build a home. They have to be, constructed well, etc. But actually on net zero, for example, we do have something called the Future Home Standard, which is set to come into place in a couple of years' time. But actually, many builders will say, look, I can build you a home that is net zero, i.e., and completely energy efficient and can be heated by renewable energy sources now. But if I'm not regulated that is the standard to which all homes must be built, then if I'm bidding for a contract, I'll be underbid by a company who will offer you a cheaper contract, but won't have the same high standards on net zero. So what companies often say is, look, please raise the overall standard, but make it a level playing field. So I think regulation is really important. In some cases, you do need subsidies. That can be because and it can be a co-financing model, like sustainable aviation fuels at the moment are 5 times more expensive than, ordinary sort of combustion fuel in aviation. So I don't think without some kind of co-financing model, I don't think that will just be developed overnight. So you probably need some form of subsidy initially to get that technology developed, and then you need to end that subsidy. And absolutely, we need to educate consumers, and also we need to each as individuals play a role in making better choices. And I think the challenge around net zero is great, that we need all three of those levers really working together. And I guess linking back to that sort of first question around monopolies, I mean, I'm not totally sure which which sort of exemption they're thinking about. I do think, again, I mean, you have to keep an eye. There are some areas where you need to really think about the role of monopolies and how you have more competition, and making sure that you're not just making things too easy for incumbent firms. And I think, again, that speaks to having the right regulation in place and strong regulators who can make sure that you aren't seeing collusion. But I generally think on net zero, there's less sort of collusion happening that's sort of keeping out new entrants when companies are setting net zero targets. I think one of the challenges actually is many of them say, if we don't have the right data on all our supply chain on where those carbon emissions come from, and again, it speaks to having better mechanisms where companies have to report their carbon emissions and share that information transparently, so that we're measuring the emissions on the same basis across different companies.
Awesome, thank you. Just final two then, probably. As the UK is likely to enter a recession, do you think that this is going to have a negative impact on the progress towards achieving net zero?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think, I guess it depends how we come out of it and more broadly, but I think it definitely makes some of the issues more challenging. I guess stepping back from it, one of the things that, though I do think there's a real opportunity, right? Because if we step back and think what is causing this recession in the UK, it's related to the high energy prices we're seeing, and in particular the high price of gas and what that has done to the cost of heating homes, etc., in the UK. And that high energy prices has led to higher inflation, which has had an impact on household incomes in real terms, and led to, you know, slower spending, slower consumption, and less investment. But many of the businesses I speak to say, you know, we should be using this moment to increase our investment in renewable energy and increase energy efficiency. So we think not just about energy supply, so thinking about investing more in renewable energy. And remember, some of the returns of that investment have gone up. So the return to installing a solar panel has gone up because the price of the return you get for that electricity generation is now higher. And the other thing is thinking about energy demand. So if we think about our homes, and this is where everyone, you know, we should be investing more in insulation in our homes, which makes our homes more energy efficient, and therefore means that overall we're demanding less energy. So I think if we are short-termists about how we approach the recession, that could be negative for our goal of net zero. But in a way, we have to remember this is a really long-term change. This is something we need to do over the next 2 decades. And so I think it's about how we use these moments to think about the investments we need to make and get the right policies in place to make those investments. And I think I've certainly seen in encouraging the appetite from the business community to have this focus on net zero has continued to be hugely strong through the recession. And they're almost saying, look, we need to use this moment to actually increase our investment in these technologies, not retreat from it.
Cool, thanks. Interesting one here, actually, and I guess this person's thinking about emissions in China and the United States, for instance, but do you think the actions taken by the UK or within the UK are relevant given that global context?
Yeah, so is this a question like, does the UK matter in the global emissions? Because I guess implicit in that question is the sense, you know, the UK is only 2% of global emissions. You know, we need to work, countries all need to be working together. And actually, if you want to, you know, the countries that can make the biggest difference to carbon emissions tomorrow are, you know, China, India, the US, you know, some of the larger economies, but also the bigger emitters, because as where I started from, the UK is already, we've done better on decarbonizing some of our emissions. So I think, yes, absolutely, we need to think about China in the global context. But the way I view it is, it's also not right. We have been one of the leaders in the design of climate governance, and also we have a duty to not make this other country's problem solely. You know, I think you have to think, where is your sphere of influence? And I think the more that we act in the UK, it encourages others to act. But I guess if you, as you know, if you're thinking about where you want to make the biggest difference, if you can have the opportunity to work on these issues in China or in India or in other countries, then yeah, that could absolutely have a big impact. And finally, on the Bank of England, should they have raised interest rates? I don't know. It was either a balance between 25 basis points or 50 basis points, but I think they did have to continue to act to get inflation under control. But I do also think we are close to the peak in interest rates, and now we need to see, hopefully that will be effective in bringing down inflation over the medium term.
Amazing, thank you. Thanks for answering that one, actually. Great, thank you very much for presenting that. Really appreciate it. And all of the resources that you provided and all of the answers in the Q&A as well. For everybody else, the recording will be made available shortly after this, and we'll also provide all the resources in an attachment to your teachers. But Rain, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time that you've taken and the effort that you've done with this one. And thank you for everybody else for joining as well. Have a lovely evening.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Rain.